I need to say this out loud because it is no longer possible to remain silent. If you're watching this video, you've probably heard of the object we call 3I Atlas, an object officially considered an interstellar body, rock, ice, space junk flying past. At least that's what we're being told. But today I don't want to talk about the object itself. I want to talk about what happened to our sun after it appeared. Before we continue, please do one thing. In the comments, let me know if you've noticed any strange solar flares, connection outages, unusual auroras, or sudden magnetic storms lately. Even if they seem minor, especially if they seem so. Because sometimes anomalies aren't noise. They're a trace. The sun is not chaos. Yes, it is active. Yes, it is turbulent. But it obeys very precise statistics. Sunspots appear, grow, and disintegrate. We know their cycle. We can predict the likelihood of flares. We don't control the sun, but we understand its behavior. So in an active region, designated AR4294, formed on the solar disk at the end of 2025, the first few hours didn't cause panic. Just another sunspot, a big one, an active one. It happens. But after just 24 hours it became clear, this spot was not behaving normally. I first saw the data late at night. They were magnetograms, maps of the sun's magnetic field. I looked at them and caught myself with a strange feeling, as if what I was looking at wasn't a natural structure, but the result of intervention. The polarity was distorted, the gradients were excessively sharp, the magnetic field loops did not grow out of the plasma as usual, they appeared forced, as if the field had been forcibly reconfigured. A colleague from the solar observatory wrote me a short message. "We can't model this spot using standard methods. It looks like it just appeared mature." This is a bad phrase. Very bad. Now there is an important point that is hardly ever discussed officially. AR4294's formation began almost simultaneously with 3I Atlas's latest close encounter with the inner solar system. Not to the day, not to the minute, but close enough that the coincidence seemed uncomfortably so. I know what you're thinking. The sun is huge. The object is small. What effect could it have? Excellent question, and that's precisely why what we saw next was so frightening. 36 hours before the sunspot reached its peak activity, instruments detected a subtle but persistent anomaly in the solar magnetic background. Not a flare, not an ejection, but a modulation. It's hard to explain in simple terms, but imagine a vibrating string. Now imagine someone carefully adjusting the frequency. Not by striking the string, but by touching it from a distance. So at that moment the sun changed the frequency of its magnetic oscillations, not chaotic, structured. When AR4294 began exhibiting extreme activity, models predicted one thing. Reality showed something else. The flashes didn't escalate, they cut off as if someone were releasing the tension, and then the tension returned, faster than it should have. This is not the behavior of an overheated star, it is the behavior of a system that is being interfered with. And here we come to what prompted several researchers to stop internal discussions and switch to personal calls. Because if we superimpose the 3I Atlas trajectory, the timescale of changes in the solar magnetic field, the moment of spot formation, then you get a picture that is impossible to dismiss. It was as if the sun responded not to an internal process, but to an external stimulus. There is only one question. What exactly did 3I Atlas do? And this is a question that we are not yet ready to answer out loud. This spot didn't grow. It was formed. When we began to analyze the structure of AR4294 in detail, the first thing that struck us was the lack of a familiar evolutionary pattern. Typically, a sunspot goes through stages: formation, strengthening, and stabilization. These phases were absent here. The spot appeared as if its magnetic architecture had emerged almost immediately in a complex configuration. The fields didn't twist gradually, but existed as a complete system, as if the result of external tuning rather than the internal chaos of the plasma. The so-called magnetic shift proved particularly alarming. It didn't correspond to any known model of the sun's differential rotation. The lines seemed to be stretched and locked in a position unfavorable to natural stability. Under normal conditions, such a structure would have quickly disintegrated, triggering a chaotic series of flares, but AR4294 held its own. Moreover, it exhibited brief periods of suppressed activity, as if the system itself was limiting its energy output. One of the solar dynamics experts said something that still plays in my head. He said, "If this were an experiment, we'd think someone was testing the limits of the star's stability." And here's where the most awkward moment arises. During the same hours when AR4294 was exhibiting sharp changes in its magnetic structure, long-range tracking sensors were detecting slight but repeated deviations in 3I Atlas's behavior. Not a trajectory, but a phase of motion. It doesn't feel like classical gravitational interaction. It's too weak. The timing is too precise. It feels as if the object wasn't acting directly, but was using a medium, a field, a resonance, a connection we can't yet describe. Some data on AR4294 disappeared from public archives a few days after the peak of activity. Not completely, not drastically. Certain parameters simply stopped updating, as if they had been decided not to be published. The official explanation is calm, recalibrating instruments, revising data. But if you've ever worked with scientific archives, you know that's not usually done. It's done when they don't want to raise any questions, and the main question, increasingly being raised unofficially, sounds frighteningly simple. If 3I Atlas is truly capable of influencing the star's magnetic structure, was this influence accidental or a demonstration? Outbreaks that should not have happened. The most alarming aspect of AR4294's behavior isn't what we saw, but what we didn't. By all calculations, this active region should have produced a series of extreme flares, but it didn't. Models pointed to an almost inevitable scenario: energy accumulation, a sudden ejection, a coronal mass ejection, and consequences for Earth's magnetosphere. The probability was assessed as high, almost routine for sunspots of this scale, but instead of the expected catastrophe, the sun seemed to change its mind. Energy accumulated, fields distorted, tension grew, yet at the critical moment, the system did not enter the discharge phase, as if someone was holding it on the brink. This is extremely strange for solar physics. Natural systems don't know how to wait. They follow the laws of thermodynamics, releasing excess energy at the first opportunity. Here, however, the energy seemed to be artificially retained. One analyst put it bluntly but accurately. He said the AR4294 looked like an active damping system, as if it had a built-in instability suppression mechanism. It was during this period that the most curious coincidences were recorded. Every time forecasts predicted a strong flare, long-range observation instruments recorded subtle but synchronous changes in the parameters of 3I Atlas. It wasn't radiation in the conventional sense, not a signal, not a beam, not a pulse. Rather, it was a change of state, as if the object were entering a certain mode of activity and then returning to its original state. It's important to understand that we're not talking about a direct impact on the sun. Even theoretically, that would seem absurd. We're talking about influence through fields, through resonance, through mechanisms that lie beyond our current physics. If such a connection exists, AR4294 could have been not a target, but an indicator, a marker that the sun was within the field of influence or observation by 3I Atlas. Some data points to an even stranger detail. During periods of flare suppression, spectral analysis of the solar corona revealed localized temperature changes unrelated to the outward release of energy. In other words, the energy didn't go anywhere. It was redistributed within the system, as if the sun were not allowed to enter a destructive mode, but was forced to maintain stability at any cost. This raises a frightening thought. If an object is capable of not only causing change, but also preventing it, then it's not a case of chaotic intervention, but of a controlled process. At this point, a word that people try to avoid saying publicly appears in the discussions for the first time. Experiment, not an attack, not an accident, but a test of the system's response to an external presence. In this scenario, the sun is neither a target nor a victim. It is part of the environment, and humanity, with all its technologies, satellites, and dependence on solar activity, finds itself caught in this experiment. If this is true, then the absence of a catastrophic outbreak is no reason to be relieved. It's a reason to question why it was prevented in the first place, and what needs to happen for the restrictions to be lifted. The moment when AR4294 began to gradually lose activity deserves special attention. This didn't happen smoothly, but rather in stages, as if the shutdown process were being carried out according to a predetermined program. During those same days, orbital calculations indicated that 3I Atlas was entering a phase of minimal dynamics. The object appeared to be completing its mission and entering a standby mode. The coincidences are becoming too numerous to simply dismiss, and this is where a question arises that is increasingly raised in closed discussions, but rarely goes beyond them. If 3I Atlas is able to influence the star, keep its activity within acceptable limits, and synchronize its actions with solar processes, then what will be the next stage of interaction? The sun is a logical first step. It dominates the system. It sets the conditions. It is the source of energy. But it is not the only element sensitive to magnetic and field influences. The next part of this story concerns not a star, but a planet, and primarily the one we're currently on. When the sun fell silent, the Earth began to listen. The transition from solar anomalies to terrestrial effects was gradual. There was no single event that could be considered a turning point. It all began with small deviations, so insignificant that, taken individually, they weren't alarming. The first signals came from magnetometers. Not a storm, not a blizzard, not a classic geomagnetic surge. These were structured fluctuations, weak but stable, as if the Earth's magnetic field were entering adjustment mode. It's important to understand that the Earth's magnetosphere is an inertial system. It doesn't react instantly, much less change its behavior without external influence. However, synchronicity has been observed here, which is not typical of random processes. The oscillations didn't coincide with solar flares, didn't correlate with solar wind flows, and didn't fit into conventional scenarios. They seemed to be a response to something happening outside the standard models. Around the same time, strange reports began coming in from communication satellites. Brief interruptions, unexplained signal delays, sharp spikes in noise levels that disappeared before operators could analyze them. These effects were too localized to suggest a global problem, but too recurring to be considered a coincidence. They arose in specific regions of the orbit, as if space itself were becoming non-uniform. Some engineers noted that the interference resembled not external radiation, but rather a change in the signal propagation environment. It was as if the vacuum in these areas was behaving differently than it should. At the same time, reports of unusual auroras began to appear. They weren't brighter than usual, nor larger, but strangely structured. The patterns were sharp, symmetrical, almost geometric, which is uncharacteristic of the chaotic nature of auroral processes. The photographs quickly spread through private channels, but official reports remained restrained. They spoke of increased activity and non-standard conditions, without attempting to delve into the causes. It was at this point that some researchers began to ask a question that had previously seemed too bold. What if Earth wasn't simply experiencing side effects, but was becoming part of a larger configuration? If 3i Atlas is capable of interacting with the fields, and the Sun has shown signs of a controlled response, then it is logical to assume that the next in the chain will be a planet with its own magnetosphere. The Earth's magnetic field is more than just a shield. It's a complex dynamic system, sensitive to external resonances. A small, properly synchronized influence can cause changes without devastating consequences, and this is precisely what we may be witnessing. Not a strike, not an invasion, but a tuning. As if the system were being tested for compatibility, for responsiveness, for its ability to maintain a stable state. One parameter, long considered unimportant, proved particularly alarming. The so-called magnetospheric standing waves, which suddenly began exhibiting anomalous synchronization. These waves usually behave independently of one another, but here, moments were recorded when they formed stable patterns that persisted longer than calculations allowed. This behavior cannot be explained by solar activity. It requires either a new physical mechanism or an external controlling factor acting subtly and selectively. Some experts have cautiously hypothesized that the Earth's magnetosphere could be used as a receiver, not as an antenna for signals, but as a medium capable of resonating with certain field configurations. If this is true, then Earth is not simply observable at this moment. It is involved. And the question is no longer what is happening, but what we are gradually being led to. What's particularly alarming is the fact that all these changes are occurring without any visible harm. There are no catastrophes, no destruction, no panic. It's as if the system is being given time to adapt, and this is precisely what is causing the greatest concern, because if adaptation is necessary, then there may be a phase ahead for which we would be unprepared without it. The next data I saw wasn't about fields and instruments anymore. It was about time, about synchronizing processes that had never coincided before. If these observations are correct, then the story of 3i Atlas goes beyond astronomy and physics. It begins to touch on the very structure of our perception of reality. The first conversations about temporal inconsistencies began quietly and cautiously. No one spoke of causality violations or paradoxes. Safer formulations were used: desynchronization, phase shift, measurement errors. The problem was that these errors began to manifest themselves simultaneously in independent systems. Atomic clocks, satellite navigation, and the synchronization of scientific instruments showed discrepancies too systematic to be random. The difference was tiny. Milliseconds, microseconds, quantities that are insignificant in everyday life. But in physics, such deviations are a warning sign, especially when they are repeated. At first, equipment failures were suspected, then the influence of magnetic storms. Then the complex relativistic correction effects. However, no single explanation fully covered the picture. The strangest thing emerged when comparing data recorded at different points around the planet. Events that should have been recorded simultaneously showed a consistent shift, as if time in these regions flowed at slightly different rates. It didn't seem like a slowdown or an acceleration, but rather like a phase shift, as if the observing system was no longer in a single time loop. It was then that a phrase usually avoided even by theorists was first heard in the discussions. Someone said that we were not dealing with a distortion of time, but with a change in the conditions of its coordination. If space can be curved, then time synchronization is not absolute. It depends on the environment, on fields, on interactions that we tend to consider background. At this point, 3i Atlas comes back into the analysis, because the time desynchronizations began to intensify precisely when the object entered certain geometric configurations relative to the Earth and the Sun. This isn't a direct coincidence or a strict correlation, but statistics are stubborn. The closer the object is to certain system nodes, the more frequent the deviations were. Some researchers have suggested that we are observing a large-scale phase resonance effect. Not a signal, not an effect, but a change in the background parameters within which our devices operate. If this is true, then 3i Atlas doesn't do anything in the conventional sense. It doesn't send impulses or intervene directly. It changes the context in which processes occur. This approach is much more frightening, because context cannot be shielded. There is no hiding from it. All systems live in it simultaneously. Even more alarming was the fact that some data collected by different groups no longer agreed upon retroactively. Archives that had previously been perfectly correlated began to diverge upon re-examination. Not completely, not crudely, only subtle details differed. Timestamps, the order of events, minor but persistent discrepancies. This created the feeling that surveillance systems were no longer viewing the same reality, as if there were several slightly shifted versions of what was happening. Officially, such effects are attributed to human error and software updates, but those who had been working with this data for years knew this had never happened before. In closed discussions, a question no one wanted to formulate directly was increasingly raised. What if the system doesn't break down, but adapts to new conditions? If 3i Atlas is indeed creating a field structure in which synchronization parameters are changing, then our infrastructure is forced to adapt, even if we are not aware of it. In this scenario, time remains the same, but the ways we measure it begin to diverge. We don't instantly lose control, we lose confidence in the coherence of our worldview. And this is dangerous not because it leads to catastrophe, but because it makes it impossible to clearly understand what is happening. Reality becomes less rigid, less fixed. All this is happening against the backdrop of the sun's continued silence. AR4294 is gradually fading, leaving behind no expected consequences. It's as if its role was temporary and already fulfilled. Meanwhile, 3i Atlas maintains its position. It doesn't retreat, it doesn't approach, it seems to be waiting, watching the system stabilize after the changes. And here it feels like we've only gotten through the initial phase. Preparation, setting up the environment, response testing. Because if the next stage is connected not with physical fields, but with information structures, then the consequences will be much less noticeable, but much more profound. At first, it seemed like a simple archiving error. One of the analysts noticed that several datasets contained values that formally referred to points in time that occurred after the record itself. No one took it seriously. These things happen. Human error, incorrect server synchronization, a failure during the data transfer. But the problem was that this data was received by different systems, in different countries, and at different times. When we started checking the original sources, it turned out the error wasn't localized. The timestamps matched within each set. In other words, everything made sense for the systems themselves. It was only our comparison between them that was illogical. Predictive models using machine learning have attracted particular attention. Some of them have begun to demonstrate abnormally high accuracy in predicting parameters that are typically difficult to model. This concerned not major events, but rather minor fluctuations, temperature deviations, weak magnetic disturbances, localized changes in plasma density. What had previously been considered noise suddenly became predictable. When the researchers tried to understand what was driving the increased accuracy, they found no new input data. The algorithms weren't receiving any additional information. They simply began to perform better, as if the environment had become more orderly. It was at this point that a strange formulation emerged, initially perceived as a metaphor. One of the developers said that the data behaved as if the system already knew what state it would reach. It sounds like philosophy, but the problem is, the mathematics confirmed it. Probability distributions began to shrink long before the events themselves, as if uncertainty were being reduced in advance. This behavior contradicts our intuitive understanding of time. We're used to thinking of the future as open and the past as fixed. Here, however, there was a sense that the future leaves a faint but measurable trace on the present. Naturally, the first explanation was hidden correlations. Perhaps the systems were picking up subtle cues we'd previously ignored, but this explanation broke down when the effect manifested itself in unrelated areas. Solar data, geomagnetic measurements, satellite parameters, and even some economic indicators have begun to show a similar trend. Decreasing randomness, increasing predictability. This is where the conversation returns to 3i Atlas, because the time windows during which the effect was enhanced coincided with periods of its special position in the Sun-Earth system. This doesn't imply a direct causal connection, but it creates the sense that the object influences not events, but the structure of probabilities within which these events unfold. If we imagine reality as a set of possible scenarios, what's happening seems to be a narrowing of that set. Some options seem to cease to be available even before the system makes a choice. In this context, the phrase data remembers the future ceases to be poetic. It becomes a working hypothesis, albeit an extremely inconvenient one for classical science. Even stranger, the effect was reversible. When 3i Atlas moved out of certain configurations, the uncertainty returned. Predictions became less accurate again, and the distributions broadened. This indicates a process that is non-destructive. It switches on and off. It modulates, as if the system were being tested in different modes. Some researchers have cautiously suggested that we are witnessing the early stages of interaction with a different form of information processing, not the transmission of messages, but a change in the very conditions of processing. If 3i Atlas truly is a carrier of highly advanced technology or autonomous intelligence, then this approach seems logical. Why talk about it directly when you can modify the environment so the system can reach the desired conclusions on its own? In this case, humanity doesn't receive a signal. It receives an opportunity to see more, to predict more accurately, to understand more deeply, but only up to a certain point. What's frightening here isn't the intervention itself, but its precision. There's no violence, no pressure, no obvious risk. Everything happens as if we're being gently nudged toward a new level of perception. This is why some researchers have begun to ask a question that was previously considered purely philosophical. What if this isn't first contact, but the first stage of recognition? What if the system isn't testing our technology, but our reaction to the changing structure of reality itself? Are we capable of noticing, comprehending, and not panicking and looking for simple enemies where they may not exist? Because if the next step is not about data, but about consciousness, the consequences will be much more difficult to capture and much harder to ignore. And more people who have seen these materials agree on one thing. What's happening now looks like preparation, not for an event, but for a state, and we're only just entering it. When people reacted first, until this point, everything could be attributed to instruments, models, and interpretations. Machines make mistakes, algorithms overfit, data gets distorted, but at some point, it became clear that changes were spreading beyond labs and server rooms. The first signs came not from scientific reports, but from scattered observations by people who were completely unrelated. The complaints were remarkably similar, though phrased differently, and in different countries. People talked about a feeling of asynchronous rhythm, a sense of shifting rhythm. Some described it as a slight rush, others as a lag, but the overall theme was repeated too often. There was no mention of hallucinations or panic. Most of the descriptions were calm, almost mundane. People simply noted that they began to more often guess the course of conversations, reactions, and minor everyday events. Psychologists were initially skeptical, the expectation effect, self-hypnosis, the influence of news. But the problem was that many of these people knew nothing about 3i Atlas or solar anomalies. Particularly interesting were the reports from people working with high-load systems. Dispatchers, pilots, traders, surgeons, those whose work requires instant decisions in uncertain conditions. They described a strange feeling of compressed choice. It was as if the number of possible outcomes had diminished and decisions were made more quickly, almost automatically, without the usual internal struggle. Some of them said it felt like a heightened state of clarity. Not euphoria, not excitement, but a feeling that the world had become a little easier to read. There were fewer signals. The structure was clearer. Naturally, the question of a mass psychological effect arose, but the statistics didn't support the classic scenarios. There was no increase in anxiety disorders, no surge in psychiatric visits, no panic. On the contrary, a temporary decrease in background stress levels was recorded in a number of regions. Heart rate variability data collected via wearable devices showed an unexpected stabilization. It was as if the environment had become less noisy not only for the instruments but also for the human nervous system. It was as if the brain had begun to function in a more orderly space. The strangest thing was that the effect was temporary. It appeared and disappeared in waves, almost in sync with the periods when the anomalies in the data intensified or weakened. Some people began to notice this after the fact. They said that on certain days, everything seemed to flow more easily, and then the world returned to its usual complexity. This doesn't seem to be a form of control or interference with consciousness. Rather, it seems to be a change in the conditions in which consciousness functions, as if the background parameters of the environment were being slightly adjusted. If we return to the hypothesis of 3i Atlas as a system that modifies context rather than events, then the human reaction seems logical. We too are part of this environment, embedded in its fields and rhythms. In closed discussions, the idea is increasingly being voiced that the human factor may be key, not as an object of influence, but as an indicator of the process's success. Machines will show numbers, algorithms will reveal correlations, but only humans can intuitively sense that the very quality of reality, and not just its individual parameters, has changed. This leads to a very uncomfortable conclusion, perhaps three. iAtlas isn't testing our technology or studying our biology. Perhaps it's assessing our ability to adapt to a different world structure. If this is true, then what's happening isn't a harbinger of disaster or preparation for contact in the usual sense. It's a test of perceptual stability, of the ability to maintain integrity in a changing context, and this is where the main risk arises. Not physical, but cultural and psychological, because not everyone reacts the same way. Some feel clarity, while others feel a loss of support. And if the changes intensify, the differences in reactions could deepen, not between countries and systems, but between ways of thinking and perceiving. The first thing that became noticeable at the societal level wasn't fear or panic. It was a divergence of interpretations. The same events began to be perceived differently, even when the facts remained the same. People looked at the same data and came to opposite conclusions. For some, what was happening looked like a period of stabilization and clarity. For others, an alarming sign of an impending threat. It's important to emphasize that this isn't disinformation in the traditional sense. The sources matched, the numbers matched, the chronology matched. What didn't match was the observer's conclusion. It feels as if the very structure of perception has begun to act as a filter. Not in the sense of ideology or beliefs, but deeper, at the level of which connections the brain considers significant and which it ignores. Sociologists initially attributed this to fatigue, information overload, and cumulative stress, but these explanations ceased to hold true when discrepancies began to emerge within professional communities. Physicists, engineers, analysts, people accustomed to working with uncertainty suddenly began to divide into camps. Not by politics, not by faith, but by their sense of what was happening. Some said the system was calming down, that the noise was diminishing, and the world was becoming more predictable. Others argued that this was a false stability, a harbinger of deeper changes. The strangest thing was that both groups presented compelling arguments, and these arguments were based on the same observations. This created an effect that, in closed reports, people began to call narrative stratification, not because someone is deliberately manipulating information, but because reality allows for multiple stable interpretations simultaneously. In such a state, any attempt at rigid control becomes dangerous. If one version of events is imposed, it will inevitably be perceived as a lie by those whose perception is tuned differently. And this is perhaps what explains the silence surrounding 3i Atlas. Not a lack of data, but the lack of a single, safe way to interpret it. When a system is unstable, noise masks differences. When the system becomes more orderly, differences come to the surface. And this applies not only to physical processes, but also to collective consciousness. Some analysts have begun to express a deeply uncomfortable thought that what's happening could be a form of selection, not biological, not technological, but cognitive. If the environment changes in a way that requires flexibility of perception, the ability to tolerate uncertainty and not go to extremes, then not all thought structures are equally stable. In this context, narrative stratification is not a glitch, but an indicator. An indication of how the system is responding to changing fundamental conditions. And here again, the question of intent arises. If 3i Atlas is truly involved in this process, it is not imposing truth. It is creating conditions in which truth ceases to be the only truth. This doesn't feel like an invasion, but rather a test of one's ability to exist in a world where there is no single, simple explanation, but rather multiple, agreed-upon realities. And it is precisely in such an environment that human conflicts become especially dangerous, because the struggle is not for resources or territory, but for the right to consider one's own interpretation the only correct one. At this point, some governments began to consider scenarios that had previously been considered theoretical. Not defense scenarios or contact scenarios, but perception management scenarios. But managing perception in a fragmented reality is a nearly impossible task. Any attempt at stabilization could exacerbate instability elsewhere in the system. This is precisely why silence becomes a strategy. Not because there is nothing to say, but because any spoken word can deepen division. But silence isn't neutral either. It leaves room for interpretation, conjecture, fear, and expectation. And when data behaves differently than before, This space fills up very quickly. The most alarming thing is that the stratification doesn't appear to be temporary, it persists even when the anomalies subside. It's as if the system has already transitioned to a new state. If this is true, then the question of 3, I Atlas, ceases to be astronomical. It becomes a question of whether we are capable of coexisting in a world where reality no longer guarantees a unified interpretation. And perhaps, this very question is key to the next stage. Because further changes, it seems, will concern not the environment, but choice. The history of complex systems reveals a disturbing pattern. A period of instability is almost always followed by a phase of apparent calm. This phase precedes an event that makes a return to the previous state impossible. This calm doesn't mean the processes have ceased. It means they've retreated to a level where they can no longer be directly observed. The system stops making noise because it has adopted a new configuration. This is precisely what is happening with 3I Atlas. Its parameters have stabilized, its trajectory has become predictable, and background anomalies have weakened. From a classical scientific perspective, the situation appears to be normalizing. But those who have been following the process for a long time know that this normalization is often the most alarming sign. It's the moment when the system has completed its preparations. During this period, researchers shifted their focus from external manifestations to internal calculations. Scenarios were modeled in which even a small additional impact would lead to an abrupt phase transition. This is where the concept of the point of no return comes in. It's not a moment of catastrophe or a moment of contact. It's a point beyond which no action can reverse the system. Several possible triggers are discussed in closed policy briefs. None of them seem dramatic. On the contrary, they all seem almost unnoticeable in everyday life. We're talking about cumulative effects, the accumulation of changes that individually are insignificant, but together create a new state of the environment. One scenario involves global synchronization of information systems, not a crash, but a coincidence of phases, when too many processes begin to operate at the same pace. Another scenario concerns collective behavior, not mass actions, but a shift in expectations. When a significant number of people begin to intuitively sense that the world should behave a certain way, such expectations themselves become a factor. They alter decisions, reactions, and priorities, and in a changed environment, this effect is amplified. Some experts call this a soft threshold. It can't be pinpointed by a single date or event. It only becomes apparent in retrospect, when it becomes clear that something has changed forever. If 3I Atlas is indeed involved in this process, its role appears to be not that of a force multiplier, but rather a catalyst. It doesn't push the system, but rather accelerates what was already possible. In this case, the question, what happens next, becomes meaningless. The more important question is, when will we realize we've crossed the line? What's scary here isn't the prospect of the unknown, but the illusion of control. We think that as long as there are no drastic events, we're still in control of the situation. But complex systems rarely warn of transition. They simply cease to be what they were. Some researchers have begun to notice this in their own thinking. They find it more difficult to return to previous explanations even when there's nothing formally stopping them. It's not a belief effect or fatigue. It's a feeling that old models no longer describe what's happening sufficiently. In this state, attempting to return to normal becomes unnatural. The system no longer considers the old norm optimal. If this is true, the near future will bring no surprises. There will be no sudden signals, objects in the sky, or official announcements. There will be a slow shift in the way we make decisions, in what is considered obvious, in which issues seem important and which are secondary. And this could be the point of no return. Not an event, but consent. Not a command, but acceptance of the new state as natural. In this scenario, 3I Atlas remains in place, not because it's waiting for an order or signal, it remains because the process isn't yet complete. While the system continues to adapt, no intervention is required. Observation and minimal parameter adjustments are sufficient. And here comes the final, most uncomfortable question: what will happen when adaptation is complete? Will the next stage be noticeable? Or will we simply one day find ourselves living in a world where some opportunities no longer arise, while others have become commonplace? History shows that it is precisely these transitions that change civilizations most profoundly, without catastrophes and without triumphs, simply because there is no turning back. And if that's true, then the current silence isn't a pause. It's a final adjustment before the system finally chooses its direction. There's a law that's rarely discussed outside of closed circles. Awareness always lags behind environmental change. We understand that something has happened only when we're already living within the aftermath, not at the moment of the transition itself. It happened with fire, with writing, with science, with nuclear energy, with the internet. Each time, humanity first adapted, and only then came up with an explanation for why the world was no longer the same. What's happening around 3i Atlas fits the same pattern. There's no starting point, no signal to go, no moment you can point to and call the beginning of a new era. Changes creep in, like the temperature in a room. You don't notice when it gets warmer, but at some point you realize the windows no longer need to be closed and your old clothes seem out of place. The system doesn't demand consent. It doesn't ask if we're ready. It simply rearranges the conditions so that old ways of thinking become less effective and new ones become natural. That's why it's so difficult to pinpoint what exactly constitutes the end of the process. There's no final chord, no contact, no revelation. There's only the moment when resistance disappears. In closed analytical reviews, this stage is called the acceptance phase without an event. This is a state in which most actors act as if the new reality had always existed. Looking back at the last few months without emotion, it becomes clear that some questions have simply ceased to be asked, not because they have been answered, but because they have lost their relevance. People are less interested in who influences the system. They're more interested in how to effectively operate within it. This is a fundamental shift in focus. When this happens, the system is considered stabilized. Not completely, but enough so that it stops reacting to previous disturbances. In this context, 3i Atlas ceases to be an object. It becomes background, like cosmic radiation or the curvature of space, which only specialists remember. The most disturbing and at the same time revealing thing is the disappearance of a sense of urgency. There is no sense of impending event, no anticipation of a climax, and this, as history shows, means that the climax is already behind us. We simply didn't recognize it as such. Some researchers have attempted to formulate the moment of completion of the process using physical parameters, field stability, noise stabilization, disappearance of anomalies, but all these signs are secondary. The real indicator is people's behavior. When the changed environment no longer provokes internal resistance, the process can be considered complete, and in this sense, recent observations seem unambiguous. We are no longer trying to return to the way things were. We are learning to live as is. This doesn't mean submission or defeat. It means that the system is no longer perceived as hostile or alien. If 3i Atlas truly is the bearer of a different logic, a different form of organizing reality, then the most effective method of interaction is not invasion, but a gradual shift in the norm. Norm is the most powerful force in human civilization. Anything that becomes normal ceases to evoke fear and resistance. That's why we may never see a message, a sign, or a moment of recognition, because there's no longer any need for it. Contact, if it occurs not as a dialogue, but as an agreement on the conditions of existence. We don't hear the question. We simply begin to live as if the answer was always obvious. And here comes the final conclusion, one that many who have worked with this data for a long time have come to. The most dangerous moment is not when something changes, but when the changes cease to be noticeable. Because it's at that moment that choice disappears. Not because it's been taken away, but because the alternatives no longer seem realistic. If we look back in a few years, we might see this period as transitional. Not dramatic, not heroic, not tragic. It was simply a time when the world became a little more orderly, a little less chaotic, and a lot less clear-cut. And if you ask the question, what did 3i Atlas do to our sun, to our planet, and to ourselves? The answer will be uncomfortable. He didn't break anything. He didn't seize anything. He didn't demand anything. He simply changed the conditions so that we ourselves became different. And perhaps that was precisely the goal.